welcome. Good evening to you all, wherever you are, from the very wet and cold north, although we're going to be spoken from, I presume, the warm, sunny south in a moment. So I'm stepping in this evening for Jos Sheeran, who's in Berlin giving a lecture, and which would have overlapped with this. So he asked me to introduce our speaker this evening, which gives me great pleasure to do. Kelly Collier is an early years specialist from South Africa. She's taught for many years in the Gaia School as a playgroup leader, and she's now working in the Center for Creative Education in Cape Town, teaching in her alma mater, I believe, where she herself did a training. And she's going to talk to us this evening from a country which, in my imagination, is always beautiful, diverse, and complex. And I'm sure those aspects will come into her presentation because she's going to talk to us about diversity. So, Kelly, great pleasure to introduce you. Over to you.
Thank you, Martin, for that introduction. I definitely wouldn't call myself a specialist, but in the earliest classroom was indeed where I found myself at Gaia Water School, as you mentioned before. So, greetings to you all. I'm honored to represent my community and my lineage today as I speak to you from the Southwestern Cape, as you said, Martin. And today we actually had spring rain, which is interesting because we are, of course, close on to December. Um, so this topic, this question of what to focus on and where to begin, when considering such a broad topic, um, a topic that's globally relevant and prominent in our modern society, was really one that I needed to grapple with, and I landed with this seed of identity. Identity being this foundation that diversity seeks to highlight. And this is going to become a core aspect of this conversation, talk, exploration, if you will. Context sensitivity is a principled way of being that involves being responsible, responsive, conscientious, and committed to respecting the lived experiences, cultural nuances, and traditions of the referred to subject. So I'd like to just give a bit of background to how I came to speak on this topic, because I'm speaking today not as a specialist, but from my own positionality and from my own lived experience to the subject. Earlier on in this year, a colleague of mine, a previous colleague now, who had been assigned this topic for the international conference at the Goetheanum in April, was herself unable to attend the conference, and then she very kindly recommended me for the topic because we had encountered each other in other spheres outside of our vocational work, but also community work, etc. And so, having recommended me, of course, I was excited to present in her place. And so, in preparation for the conference, I had the privilege of working with, or corresponding with rather, in short and limited amounts, with my co-presenter who is from Brazil. And it was interesting to see the parallels that emerged through our explorations, which were each rooted in our own cultural context, in our own historical context of our respective continents and countries. And then to just to close off this very short side story, then due to visa processing delays, I unfortunately didn't attend the conference either.
Right.
And so, which brings us to this point today where I share with you today what some of the research that I've done, the reflections that I had gone through and explored, and insights that I gained on this topic, which are, of course, in addition to my own embodied awareness of this topic. And so today I'd like to invite you to look at the first slide, which is a definition. So these definitions, I'm going to read through them. Unfortunately, they are uh, dry textbook definitions, but we will attempt to enliven them um, with a practical injection of imagery afterwards. So this first definition comes from a management based kind of perspective. Diversity is defined as real and perceived differences among individuals or groups and the way in which these differences affect interactions and relationships, as well as the status of different groups in organizations. The types of differences include general ones of gender, ethnicity, nationality, and sexual orientation, as well as the individual differences such as personality. Theoretical and empirical knowledge of diversity draws from several fields, including psychology, social psychology, cognitive psychology, sociology, anthropology, cultural sciences, race and ethnic relations, as well as management. Though the relevant types of diversity might differ from one country to another, the core issue is how to effectively manage the benefits of diversity and mitigate its negative effects, as well as preventing the exclusion and devaluation of members of non-dominant groups. So one could see how a definition such as this would be applied to something like policy and framework within a working environment, which is where this definition came from. I'd like to look at the next slide, please, which speaks to context. The definition of context, and the definitions that follow now are from the Oxford Dictionary. Context: the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood. The parts of something written or spoken that immediately precede and follow a word or passage and clarify its meaning. So yeah, how do we broaden the picture? How do we create and paint the landscape that tells more of a story of that particular snapshot, that particular moment in time, position, event, extraction, right? Sensitivity. And so here are these three definitions, which are very interesting. The quality or state of being hypersensitive. So this now denotes not only being awakened to your senses, but in a heightened state of being aware of your senses. The second definition, the capacity of being easily hurt. And lastly, the awareness of the needs and emotions of others. The last definition, quite a straightforward one, diversity, the practice or quality of including or evolving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds and of different genders, sexual orientations, etc. So I think that is the generic kind of perception of how we see diversity. So when we look at homogeneous groupings or communities with shared characteristics, this connects us to the collective identities through the stories of these identities, through the traditions, through the experiences of the people that shape who they are. These narratives provide substance to our sense of self as human beings and also foster a deep sense of belonging and continuity through the group. And so this brings me to the next slide. The title of my talk today is Let People Tell the Truth: Context, Sensitivity, and Diversity. And so when I was contemplating this topic, and as I mentioned earlier, it was a topic which was one of the banner statements which were elected by the planning group of the conference. And so I had to find my own personal entry point into it, which I could very easily do because, you know, it's that kind of topic which is very broad and you can position it. This is the statement that came to me. My truth is dictated by or subject to context. So I'd like to unpack this a little bit more now. Our identities and the truths that we hold are deeply rooted into the context of our lives. The questions that I asked myself, and I challenge you to ask yourself also, which we'll look at a little bit later in groups. The first one was, what is your demographic? So this was a question I asked myself, what is my demographic? How do other people see me? How am I perceived in the world? And how does that affect my perception of myself, of course? And the second question, so the first one, what is your demographic? The second question, how does this grouping, and this now is referring to your age, your culture, your gender, background, how does this influence your voice? How does all of this influence my voice in the world today, in the context that I am responsive towards, responsible for? Our position and status dictates how we are treated in society. My truth is dictated by, or you could say, subject to context. Each of us is shaped by the stories of our families, our communities, our histories, as I said earlier. And these stories influence, of course, how we see ourselves and how we see the world. When we consider the role of context in truth, we know that our truth is shaped by our experiences. So what we've lived through, this would be different for different generations. Our culture, what are the practices that our livelihood is steeped in? What are the beliefs that we live our lives by, which form our traditions? And then, of course, there's this societal context, which denotes then the systems, the ordinances that govern our lives, the norms by which we live. Are we in a position of privilege? What does that mean? What kind of privilege do we experience? Have we experienced oppression? In which situated position is that? What is the context of that oppression? But still, yet this does not define our essence as human beings. We know this. But the context is there, the story, the background, the outside ingredients, the weather, the elements are there. So the power of storytelling is one which allows us to honor diversity. It uncovers truth and it helps us to build bridges. By reclaiming our voices and by bringing ignored or hidden stories to light, we can build understanding through listening and connecting and also recognizing our shared humanity, which of course can lead us to grow, can lead us to a position of reconciling as society, and also foster the healing of transgenerational trauma, which is something which exists globally. I would like to look at the next slide, please. And so I will begin with a biographical sharing. My personal biographical sharing will focus on Cape Town, here, of course, in the Western Cape, which is one of the 9 provinces of South Africa. This is where I was born and raised. Cape Town, as many of you know, is known as the Mother City, and it is a popular tourist destination, currently ranked as one of the second most, actually the second most beautiful places in the world to live and to visit. Cape Town is known for its diverse locations, its landscape. Its indigenous name is Pugaub, which is a Kokogwab word, an indigenous name meaning where the clouds meet, which speaks to the description of how the clouds gather on Table Mountain, and Cape Townians often refer to that as the tablecloth, which of course is a result of the Cape Point's geographical positioning and the elements of weather that come together that creates this positioning. So we in terms of our landscape, we have beaches, forests, gardens, mountains, grasslands, nature reserves, the winelands, which many of you know. And one of our most unique features is our fynbos. This diversity also extends to the people who live here. The majority of the Western Cape's population, around 65% of the population, has three main ancestral roots with some European heritage. The first group includes indigenous peoples like the Kam, the Kuna, and the Xhosa. The second group is made up of slaves from across Africa, India, Sri Lanka, Bengal, Southeast Asia. And these are people who greatly influenced the Cape identity over the last 200 years. The third group consists of people of color from various global origins who migrated to the region. This research is from Camisa Museum by a researcher called Tariq Patrick Millet. Can we please go to the next slide? So this brings me to this topic of the Camisa heritage. So Camisa is the name of a river which is situated, which springs forth from Table Mountain and finds its way through different points and still today runs to the sea. The Camisa or African Creole lineage traces its roots back to 3,000 years to South Africa's earliest inhabitants and the late 16th century when the Cape of Good Hope became a key shipping hub. So this Camisa, meaning place of sweet waters, was a river which ran with fresh water, which of course represented an opportunity for people who were voyaging to stop there and replenish and refresh and heal and um, take a break along their journey. So, woven into the story, the indigenous communities, including the Hochschule tribe, which was led by Outshamo, or as he was also called, Heri the Strandloper. He was the leader of the Kamakwa tribe, which means watermen, and managed a port operations alongside the Camisa River. This proto-trading and service community provided essential supplies to visiting ships, such as meat, fresh water, food and wild roots and foods that they had foraged, medicinal remedies, and materials for ship repairs. They also facilitated communication through a unique type of postal system where ships who were passing by could leave post for ships who would be coming at a later stage, or they could collect post, and in that way, communication was forged, and it was a type of post office. And that was of course, with agreement with trusted individuals who served as the postman. By the time that Jan van Riebeeck arrived in 1652, and this is a very significant year and timing because I remember when I was at school, in primary school, this was one of the main rhetorics that we would learn in history was 1652. In 1652, Cape Town was founded by Jan van Riebeeck. So it's drilled in my consciousness from my primary school years. And now looking at it, it's so interesting to see the history beyond the history. And so by the time Jan van Riebeeck arrived in 1652, there was already an organized port community, which was led by the Kamakwa, which was already thriving. And as I said, they were known as the Watermans. They were indigenous Khoi people who had adopted certain European practices while maintaining their distinct cultural identity. And this was that before the Dutch came to the Cape, of course, there had already been voyagers who had come and visited and interacted with the people. And there was already, as I've mentioned before, there was a proto-trade that was already being established. And so the name Camisa, which is derived from this Khoi term for water, also reflects this river centrality to this meeting place of diverse cultures. So today the Camisa River flows and continues to flow beneath Cape Town. It's now hidden underneath layers of urban infrastructure, And in a way, this shows a symmetry to the rich identities of people who are now known as colored, labeled as colored, and how these identities have been obscured by the layers of colonial erasure and the imposed narratives that have been created. And by uncovering these hidden stories, we begin to recognize that there's this vibrant indigenous and Creole community that has flourished and ever since this positioning of the Camisa River and the people who came and visited there. This community laid the foundation for the city of Cape Town and shaped its diverse heritage. If you could go to the next slide, please. The tributaries of the Camisa Africans or colored roots of origins are 195. It's quite a big number, right? And so we can see that 68% of the roots are founded in Africa, Madagascar, and the Cape indigenous Africans, of course, are connected to those roots of origins. Can we go to the next slide, please? And 32% being in India and South Asia. We'll go a little bit more into that. So the free blacks of the Cape indigenous Africans have ancestral connections to the Khoi, who of course were the first people of Southern Africa, the people that experienced systemic genocide, displacement, erasure of their cultures and their histories, and still today they embody the cultural heritage of the land. The next image you can see is African and Asian enslaved peoples. These were people who were individuals who were forcibly taken from their homelands in Africa and Asia. They were subject to enslavement during the colonial era, and they also contributed significantly to the cultural, economic, social landscape of the regions where they were enslaved. The free blacks of the Cape trace their root of origin to emancipated African and Asian enslaved peoples, indigenous groups, and also those of mixed heritage. We could go to the next slide, please. The next slide depicts Cape nonconformist Europeans. So the Cape nonconformist Europeans were settlers at the Cape who diverged from the dominant colonial ideologies and practices, and they often embraced alternative social, religious, or political beliefs. Their roots of origin reflect a blend of European heritage and the distinct cultural dynamics of the Cape, shaped by the interactions with the indigenous communities and the enslaved peoples. There were also the Maroons, the Oorlams, and the Troosters. The Maroons were descendants of enslaved Africans who escaped from plantations and established independent communities, often in remote areas. The Oorlams, a group of mixed heritage people, primarily descendant from Khoi and European ancestors, who played a key role in the Cape's colonial history. The Troosters, a subgroup of Oorlam, who were characterized by their role as marginalized communities, and they have roots both in the Khoi and the African heritage. And the last group, exiles, refugees, and convicts who came to the Cape from diverse backgrounds. This included political exiles, religious refugees like the Huguenots, and enslaved Africans, as well as British convicts. We can go to the next slide. So this slide speaks to the original people called the Men of Men, who were directly descended from what is called the cradle of humankind. The Cape Khoi and Cape San in Cape Colony endured a unique and severe form of ethnocide or genocide, facing 169 years of warfare and assault that no other community in South Africa had experienced. These communities displayed remarkable bravery and resistance over this extended period, and the colonial devastation in the Cape Colony is comparable to some of the worst atrocities and crimes against humanity recorded. The damage from this prolonged conflict was irreversible, resulting in a loss of culture, language, land, livestock, and resources with no restitution. The lives of people of color became heavily regulated through legislation, marking a transition from one era to another, where political struggle became predominant. By 1836, all people of the Cape of color were collectively labeled as colored in official statistics, with a one-time change in 1865. We can change slides, please. Kamisa is my story. It acknowledges my ancestral lineage, the indigenous Griqua, Damara, Kumanisan, St. Helena Bay indentured slaves from the West Indies, settlers from Dutch, German, English, and Malaysian origin. I'm choosing to focus the view of this broad topic on my own story, as it is evident to me that who we are is what we contribute to the world. We can only make an impact in society if we are creating, working, and living in an authentic way. We can only see others and see ourselves and empower others when we can only see others when we see ourselves and empower others when we are able to support ourselves. A way that we can connect the past, the present, and the future is by becoming ourselves absorbed into the story. When we know what has been, we can see where we are in a different context. As a young person, I just entered high school at Grassy Park High School on the Cape Flats in 1994, when the first democratic election in South Africa took place. For the first time in our country, all races were legally allowed to vote, which was paving a way for a new constitution and a new dispensation in South Africa. It was around this time in my life that I recall a feeling of unexplained dissatisfaction and disillusionment with the schooling system, amongst other systems. And I struggled to find a sense of belonging and to recognize my truth in the narratives that were the doctrines of this time. Remnants of the apartheid legacy, which still affirmed white domination culturally, politically, and economically. This dissatisfaction led me on a search for what I can only articulate now as deeper truths beyond the confines of my home, religion, and modern societal trends and influences. I wanted to learn to know myself better. And I can only say this now in hindsight, almost 30 years later. As a young adult leaving school, I felt compelled to begin a process of self-acceptance, re-education, and searching for stories about my ancestry, particularly my African heritage, a part of me that I had been yearning to know more about. I was searching for and collecting parts of myself that I had lost. So we will now go to the next slide. And there are two questions which will be posted in the chat. The one question shows up here on the slide and the other one will show up in the chat. And we are going to take a 7-minute breakout moment to look at these questions. I would imagine that the first half of that time would be a self-reflection. And then based on that, there can be an open sharing if that is what you are moved to do. So the first question says, in reference to what is your demographic and how does this grouping, meaning your age, your culture and your gender, your background, influence your voice? So the first one, what is your demographic? And the second question, how does this grouping, your age, culture, gender and background, influence your voice? Right. So unlocking social power. So that was quite, I know, a powerful sharing just in terms of the history of South Africa. And it's brought me to this point, to the the title of this next section, Biting the Hand That Feeds You. So I know that the tone of what was shared was was very overwhelming, was very powerful, and I hope that everyone can find a position of digestion with that. It will take, I think it takes time, and it's of course generational history. But then connecting it back to this the topic, emancipation from colonial imposition on identity is what the title of this topic speaks to, biting the hand that feeds you. Because as you can imagine, for someone who's in a position of having been marginalized, having been oppressed, in order to reclaim your sovereignty, in order to reclaim your identity as an individual, not in terms of anarchy or in terms of um, a vibration of negativity, but rather about a true way of social living. Yeah. So finding some kind of restoration and moving back into the picture of a true sense of social living. So I continue. In the country of my birth, I am called colored. So this is meant to define who I am racially. Yet in South Africa, for the majority of the population, it still represents, in a sense, my societal worth. It largely dictates the quality of life that I will lead or that South Africans lead and the opportunities that are afforded to you. It is a label that's imposed by the colonial system or by a colonial system designed to control, to fragment, to erase. So to understand the root of its label, we have to look at its roots. Colonialism, with its hierarchies, divided people into different categories that denied their history, their culture, and their humanity. So this image that you see in front of you is an image from Hout Bay. It's an aerial um, image taken in Hout Bay. And you can see that to the left, there are houses which are spaciously uh, planned, and you can see that, I mean, you actually can't see the quality of the type of living, but clearly there's much more space. The spaces are greener. There's a sense of freedom and opulence. Hartbeespoort is a very affluent community. You know, people are very well established financially, largely white. And then to your right, you can see the informal area, the shacks, and you see some kind of formal housing over there. So this image speaks to I want to contextualize marginalization a little bit. What does it mean to be marginalized, right? Um, of course, there are environmental impacts to this marginalization, where we can see due to architectural apartheid, people lived separately in different kind of living conditions. But marginalization also obviously extended to how people were able to access education, more so higher education, um, how they lived, how do they get to work, how do they function within their own households, do they do their own housework, do they have enough food, clothes, and shelter, enough to cover the basics of their life in the 21st century. We know the cost of living is so high. And so those are other elements in addition to what we are mainly focusing on today, which is the psychosocial aspects, this point of self-worth, this point of belonging as a core. So if we could go to the next slide, please. According to N. Magetlana, South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world by race, class, and gender. Education particularly is inequitable, where schools in wealthier areas, particularly and predominantly white areas, flourish. Others that serve the majority of the non-white population struggle with a lack of resources, which results in overworked teachers, crowded classrooms, outdated materials, lack of toilets, etc. Still beyond these physical indicators, if we could go to the next slide, of the deficiencies that are lived with, which are lived with reality for the people of South Africa, the people of color of South Africa. There are social and psychological effects which are carried in our community soul, bodies, and minds. Tariq Jenkins, a human rights defender, quoted in June Bam's book titled Aussie Told Me, and he said the following: every day in the Cape, we live with intergenerational trauma of uninterrupted waves of great physiological, spiritual, and psychological intensity, and wounds that are rooted in the late 1600s and beyond. If we could go to the next slide, please. Furthermore, Orlando Patterson in 1952, defined the essence of slavery as a relationship of power and domination that originated and was sustained by violence. He described it as a social death, where individuals were stripped of their autonomy, their identity, and their community status. This concept extends beyond the historical institution of slavery, as communities are trapped in cycles of dispossession with their identity and their histories are fragmented. For many young people growing up in the Cape Flats, and I'm now going to refer to one of those dead spaces because there are many elements of spaces when we talk about a social death. For example, one of these dead spaces is a result of the lack of opportunity, the lack of stability, which renders the youth vulnerable. As they are without a sense of identity or belonging, they seek it elsewhere. According to Wood and Lane, who argued in their literature review on gang theory, that the phenomena of gangs is indeed a combination of a deteriorating social culture, structure, and bonds, low economic status, inequality of opportunity, and status frustration that could lead to gang membership. From a psychosocial perspective, it may then be argued that young people are at risk merely by virtue of being human and by displaying their need for identity, status, and companionship. The challenge we face today is confronting the ongoing structures of power and domination, not just in areas like policy or economics, but also within education and cultural spaces. These systems of inequality are deeply ingrained, shaping who has access to opportunities and influencing how people are perceived and valued in society. The next slide. Decolonization then becomes a crucial process. It's about more than just revisiting the past. It is about actively restoring dignity, rebuilding identities, and creating genuine connections with communities. This process involves challenging and breaking down the systems that have perpetuated oppression and replacing them with ways that can recognize and elevate the diverse stories and experiences of those who have been silenced or overlooked. A key part of this work is reclaiming stories, languages, and indigenous knowledge. These are just not remnants of the past. They are vital sources of identity, strength, and wisdom. By bringing these elements back into our lives and our education, we begin to dismantle the structures of social death and replace them with a foundation of empowerment, belonging, and shared humanity. Next slide. The next slide, please. Transformative healing through indigenous knowledges. Africa is a continent rich in indigenous philosophies that offer many opportunities for cultural renewal and educational transformation. These knowledge systems can provide a culturally and socially responsible framework for teaching and learning. The need for this could not be more urgent, as the effects of society are apparent. This is especially true for the next generation of youth. According to Mwanga Zake in 2009, these systems have perpetuated Western worldviews as superior, erasing traditional beliefs and fostering a false global view of identity. The result has been the near extinction of indigenous pedagogies amongst younger generations, leaving them disconnected from from the heritage, their cultural roots. And in order to address this disconnection, education systems must integrate indigenous knowledge systems into the curricula in order to facilitate transformative healing and reconnection of authentic identity. One such African philosophy, Ubuntu, in essence meaning I am because we are, emphasizes the principles of unity, compassion, and respect. Indigenous knowledge systems offer a wealth of insights across various disciplines. If we could move to the next slide, please. And again, one more.
Is it this one or the next one?
One more, thank you.
Oh no, wait. This one.
Good. That's correct, yes. Traditional games and music. The next one. So we can look at how the next one, please, Lisa, with the goal. That's one, that's it. So we could look at how indigenous systems offer the opportunity to uh, infuse these methods into pedagogy. Traditional games and music give us the opportunity to integrate movement, rhythm, and play into learning, using body learning as a pedagogy. Next slide, please. Indigenous languages are about preserving cultural heritage and optimize self-expression. The next one. Storytelling and oral traditions make use of local legends, myths, and oral history to teach cultural values, history, as well as critical thinking. The next slide. By learning about foraging and traditional medicine, knowledge of local fauna and flora for medicinal use, as well as food, veldkos, learning about foraging, wild food, and sustainable living. The next slide, please. Sustainable farming practices using indigenous ecological knowledges to teach environmentally friendly techniques. Rites of passage, about incorporating initiation ceremonies where we mark the stages of life, which promotes an instilled sense of belonging and responsibility. Ethnomathematics, highlighting African contributions to maths through spatial design, construction techniques, symbolic systems such as basketry, the sonar drawings of Mozambique, which are quite similar to form drawing, not dissimilar to form drawing, weaving, storytelling as mathematical expressions. African cosmologies, indigenous perspectives on human existence and the universe. Local history and geography, place-based education to foster environmental custodianship, ethnic pride, identity, social justice. The next slide. And ecological activism, learning about sustainable practices, a respect for the environment, water, land resource, and the governance thereof. We can move to the next slide, please. This image is from a recent ecological uh, protest that happened in Pinelands on a piece of land, which is a green lung just out of the CBD of Cape Town. And an international company bought this land a couple of years ago, and there was a struggle over a series of about 10 years, a process of about 10 years. And so this was from earlier November. And it was interesting just to see that in this current day and time, that developments are still being built on top of land resource and water resource, which are actually cultural and ecological heritage spaces. We can move to the next slide, which brings us to context sensitivity. So when we look at context sensitivity and how to apply context sensitivity to our practice, to our interactions with each other as colleagues, respect is a central aspect. It's a big part of how we manage our interactions with each other. As human beings, we are intuitively wired to know when our presence, our opinions, our contributions are valued, and building mutual respect means that we approach every intention with thoughtfulness and humility. We allow space to understand the position of the other. This is also about recognizing the value of all knowledges, intergenerational wisdom that has been passed down through the ages. We should also consider how we share power and resources that impact decision making. Challenging our biases is about recognizing and challenging our own judgments so that we can make decisions that are fair and act in a way that serves the circumstances with awareness and consciousness. An openness to grow and commitment to learning about other backgrounds, cultures, histories. This helps us to interact and communicate respectfully and progressively. To amplify voices is the last aspect of context sensitivity. By applying deep listening, creating safe spaces for the marginalized voice to be heard, building relationships with communities and knowledge keepers to facilitate engagement across the barriers of differences, whilst being mindful of the nuances in the approach to communication. Still, with all of this said, the situation is not all bleak. There are many initiatives which are focused on developing and healing and remembering, bringing and remembering the parts of our dismembered society in South Africa. And one of the role players in that, a powerful role player in that, is the work of the CCE. The Center of Creative Education is a beacon of light as a teaching college that uses the Waldorf creative-based approach. I say this not only as a staff member now, which would denote a measure of bias on my part, of course, but also as a past student. I was once a student at the CCE, and I can say that it changed my life. It felt like coming home where my lecturers were friendly and they were spiritually attuned. The education was art-based and they approached the content with methods that were accessible, were expressive, and resonant with what my soul was longing for. I could identify with the connection to nature, the acknowledgement and approach towards the human being as holistic, not only cognitive, and I deeply resonated with the elements of the world of creative education curriculum and pedagogy because I think they are founded on the same principles as indigenous cultural education. Both emphasize a system of awareness of the gift of the past, the present, and future generations as contributors to societal values. They stress the preservation of archetypal history through song, folklore, games, arts, and various forms of movement. These principles felt deeply familiar and aligned with my own cultural heritage, making the learning experience meaningful. The developmental approach that you are guided into as a student teacher towards an attitude of care and interest in others, and specifically your students as a part of a destiny journey, the bond that the teacher creates with students. All of this and more are foundational. As with many other higher learning institutions, the CCE has also had to journey through how to grow and ensure that we can operate legitimately. We strive to offer students certified quality teacher education that meets the requirements of national governance and accrediting bodies. And as a lecturer now in the early childhood courses, I can also see the impact of colonial and apartheid education on the students who are soon to be teachers and how we have been affected as a nation and conditioned through life experiences. We at the CCE understand the assignment as a faculty and as a Waldorf institution. We are carrying this potential of creative education for every child in South Africa. This is a very big but a worthy ambition, and here enters this grappling of how do we maintain methodologies proven to work yet nurture the soul of Africa and the children and the identity that only we can define and propagate. The connection to and respect for nature. Using the Waldorf approach and methodology offers a significant opportunity, rooted in its emergence as a solution to the hardships experienced by people in the aftermath of World War One. In that era, Germany's societal, economic, and political structures were in turmoil, and Rudolf Steiner emerged as a leader, and his insightful and human-centered perspectives offered a way forward. One could say he was guided by God or by the spiritual world. Of this, Henry Barnes also articulated the current times require transformation. Our society faces profound unmet human, social, and educational challenges. World of education holds the potential to foster healing and bring about positive change for individuals and society. Planting the seed of world of education into the soil of communities that utilize it, indigenizing the curriculum, can position this educational methodology as a tool for preparation for the development of society and education in the 21st century. The future demands a profound responsibility to rehabilitate society from the resulting traumas that impact spirit, culture, social structures, economy, and environment. Here we can understand how facilitating education that listens to the authentic voice of the people that it serves, tells their stories, and unlocks their social power by respecting who they are and seeks to honor the past and the present. This kind of education system can serve as a cornerstone for the transformation towards an enlightened future. And the last slide. Legitimizing the value of indigenous knowledges as a global community is intrinsically a part of a community responsibility. As a part of the healing process, we do this by seeing the people who have been made invisible and by listening to the voices that are disregarded. I thank you. Thank you for your time and blessings to you all.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for that very personal, biographical, historical, socio-cultural perspective on the question of diversity. I think that was deeply moving and also extremely informative. And I'm sure there'll be questions, but while people are thinking of their questions, I'd like to put a question to you. To what extent do you think the Waldorf movement in South Africa is listening to indigenous voices, is familiarizing themselves with indigenous practices? To what extent does this play a role in the curriculum?
I think that was very much part of what motivated me to focus my talk on this very subject because I'm in the position of working for the Waldorf educational high institution that trains teachers. So I know exactly what is being shared. And I think it's more about the mind shift. Yeah. And so the methodologies and the pedagogy is easily adaptable. That is why I brought this picture of how uh, when one puts indigenous knowledge systems and anthroposophy alongside each other, it's speaking the same truth. It's based in the same wisdoms. It's based on universal truths and the you could almost say common sense understanding of humanity. And when one applies that to what a human being needs to learn and be socialized into, and looking at the various aspects of that, the spirituality, the cognition, the physical, all of those different elements are met when one looks at it through the correct lens. So to me, it's more about the self-empowerment of the teachers within the context of recentering Africa. So hence the title, Biting the Hand That Feeds You, because emancipation And a change of perception is a personal thing, right? In as much as, of course, we have spaces which are conducive to that and spaces which are not conducive to that. But I can say that I feel that there is definitely the door is open to people wanting to know more and to be blatantly, brutally honest. About I think it was about 6 years ago, I attended a conference where for the first time in my life, in my interactions and association with Waldorf, there was this very loud call to say we need to localize context. And there was this clear statement that it is not um, the way I perceived it as before, where, there was this very sort of, this is the testament, this is the archetype, and we do not move away from the archetype. There was a very clear shift. And so now the practical of how does that then relate to curriculum? How do we then recenter what we are working with within the local context? Yeah, which is a practical unpacking. Yeah. So I think it's a very complex question, but I hope that I answered it to some extent.
Mhm.
Yeah, there are many different layers.
Thank you. Perhaps I see there are some other colleagues from South Africa in the Zoom space. Perhaps you'd like to
Yes,
add
please.
to that perspective.
Yes.
I see Joan and Mary G, or at least on page one anyway.
You want to go there? I thought there were other questions. I mean, we can, but yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I just wondered my question, how do you see it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think well, for me, what Kelly has just said is beautiful, and she's very kind and very polite, I think. And it is a journey, and for us in South Africa and for many countries, I think it's on the one hand, it's a personal grappling that we all have to make as teachers, and to look at our own demographics, and also to find our relationship to our own stories. There are just so many different our own indigenous stories, and then to place and context. So as Kelly says, it is complex, and it is beautiful, and we are gifted here with the complexity of it, and of so much that we can share. So by no means are we near where we should be, for sure, but certainly we feel the intention and the willingness to engage and to go there and to open up and share and be vulnerable and to learn from each other. I think like never before. I was certainly that's well, I feel that. I hope others do too. And certainly with Kelly's help and grace and insights and so on, we have many gifts from people like Kelly. So it's not a simple answer, as Kelly says.
Thank you, Mary G. And just to, yeah, if I can just, I think the urging really, and I go back now again to the topic of, and it's quite cheeky, right? Biting the hand that feeds you, right? Because it is, and I mean, cheeky is not even the right word to say, but it is about Africans claiming their sovereignty, just like Europeans claim their sovereignty in the way that in every way that you live, in the way that you express yourself, in the way that you articulate yourself, even your presence in a conversation. So there is so much work to do just in terms of the self-development. And I think that is a real gem in what the world of teaching, uh, pedagogy brings for the teacher training itself, in the way that it gives teachers the opportunity to center with himself and have that some journey, a little bit of journeying and exploration of self-development, because it's exempt from our public system curriculum. So very few of the majority of our population experience the arts, experience opportunities to express themselves, experience opportunities to think outside of those margins, because they are facing reality and they have to live in that reality. One of the sort of um, kind of pictures I was thinking about was I thought, if I were trying to describe what marginalism is, it's like if I were to try and do the Zoom with a splitting headache, yeah, I'm trying to do something, but there's something that is it's impacting my very being, yeah. I try to get to work, but I don't have a car. I've got to get up 3 hours before the time in order to be there, deal with the weather, deal with how do I manage my life, um, you know, how do you enter spaces of research and delving back into the remembering of our communal soul? Where are the opportunities for that? Where's the investment in that? So it's very complex and it's very broad, but with the African principles and philosophies such as Ubuntu, I mean, we see what the South African nation can achieve, because of the ingrained human-centered principles, which were part of the reason why we were able to move through, such difficult trials that faced our country and bring it into a positive space where I mean, our conflict resolution facilitators are world renowned to try and solve other people's problems, right? So the tone is there, the energy is there, the vibration is there, the willingness is there. It's really about now the practical nuts and bolts and getting down to, okay, so how do we actually do this in a way that honors, yeah? And so, yeah, I don't want to talk too much. I've spoken enough.
Thank you. Christoph put his yellow hand up, and after Christoph, Joan, the other Joan, who I've just suddenly seen. Christoph.
Yeah, Kelly, I very much admired your presentation. It was highly interesting and very informative. When I heard Martin's question, then he basically asked, so I understood that, if there is a striving in South Africa to localize the curriculum, that there is coming more content in the curriculum that has its indigenous roots, or does it just stay as the Europeans have brought it? I guess that is so I understood him that he wanted to know that. And may I ask you, is there something going on this path? That's the first question I have. Is it understandable?
You need to put your mic back on, Kelly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So that's a very good question. Yes, thank you for reiterating Martin's question and bringing it back to that point. There is work being done at large, even mainstream education. Yeah, the decolonialization is the buzzword. And I think for us, as Waldorf educators, it's about how can we also integrate that with Waldorf practice and not lose the value of the spiritual impulse into education, the arts impulse into education. And so it's a very interesting position that the Center for Creative Education is in at the moment, because it's about actually managing all of these different possibilities. And so to say that in a way, that's why I go back to this position of identity. What we can do now is encourage people to research. So active research, action research, and apply that to your work. So the focus is on training teachers who understand the pedagogy, who understand the methodology, and through understanding that and referring to an understanding of child development, they can create material, they can seek out material and be a part of creating the new curriculum actively.
And may I ask you, sorry to ask it so precisely, is that already happening? or is that what the plans are? What is the role of a Center of Creative Education in this?
In this process.
Mm.
So it is happening in the way that students are encouraged to do this.
Yeah, okay.
But because
Because that research is not easy, huh?
yes, exactly.
They need help.
They do.
Mm.
And so of course we need to grow and we will develop. But
Yeah.
as Mary G and I think other colleagues will say, we are on the path and the consciousness is there and people are doing what they can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so
People are doing
much,
what they
Kelly.
can.
Thank you,
Wonderful.
Christoph. Joan, would you like to come in? I see you've put your hand down, but you can certainly contribute now. No.
Is that
Couldn't
Joan
go.
Rayner
Yes.
or Joan
Maybe.
Slee?
You.
Me.
Yes.
Hi, Joan Rayner. I would like to just thank Kelly as a colleague for what she has brought and really acknowledge the depths of the complexity of the situation that we face in South Africa, but also the challenge, but also the opportunity that it brings us, because the world is talking about diversity and we are facing it as a challenge daily and are confronted with stepping beyond our own boundaries of our own socialization, what we've grown up with, and having to experience again and again that I do need to shift my mindset to understand another perspective, a perspective which I will never really understand because I haven't grown up in it. And to be able to expand one's own mental horizon to see that there are very different lived experiences, very different life experiences, and very different ways of being which can and do coexist in Africa. And the humanness is kind of the basis of what makes it possible. And I want to bring a crazy example to you, which has got nothing to do with Waldorf education. And then I'll bring you an example from the Center for Creative Education, maybe just touching on that. And I'll try and make it quick. Our rugby team, the Springbok rugby team at the moment, is a classic example of what is possible in South Africa when people all work together and play together. You know, rugby is not such a popular game in the whole world, but our Springbok team has become really number one in the world. And it's not because they are better players necessarily than others, but it's their mindset. It's that the coach has brought people together from all walks of life, well, from all different cultures and cultural streams and population groups, and has said, you are here for the team. You are here for South Africa. You are playing for South Africa. You're playing for the team. You are not playing just for yourselves. And yet, of course, each of you needs to have the expertise and the expert skill that you need to be a good rugby player. And just to see how that team in their matches and in the way that they play out of a truly human, supportive, interactive mindset. I think it's like a current example of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which Desmond Tutu and others created, which is a mindset which asks you to go beyond your own pain and your own perspective and to see things from another perspective. And that's a stretch of soul which I think is vital today and not easy at all. And it makes we have to be vulnerable and humble and accept that we can't do it. We make mistakes every single day again. And the CCE, I think what I'm discovering, I'm working there as well now, and what I'm discovering in trying to bring together the Waldorf curriculum and the state curriculum, I realized that the policy curriculum, the state curriculum, is actually very aligned to Waldorf, the holistic, creative Waldorf approach. but they don't yet have the methodology of, or the teachers are not yet trained. The current teachers in South Africa have not had the same kind of experience that we perhaps see as is natural in a Waldorf school. And so there again, I see at the Center for Creative Education, I see a real opportunity of enhancing both the Waldorf curriculum here by contextualizing it in the state curriculum, and the other way around, enhancing the state curriculum by bringing in the 100 years of experience of a creative education into what they've got in their policy, but not yet in their practice. So I see that these two can actually feed into each other and enhance both. So I think we're at a very, very interesting place in terms of contextualizing Waldorf education here in South Africa.
Thank you. Could I pass over to the other Joan, who's here this evening from South Africa, Joan Rayner?
Hello. I think that one of the biggest challenges that we in South Africa face is the location of where Waldorf schools are. Because they are not state funded and they are private schools, our students come from wealthy homes. Our schools are located in previously white areas. So our schools are almost suffering from spatial apartheid. And this makes the challenge of bringing the unheard voices incredibly difficult. It's a huge challenge. And I think that we are seeing more and more that schools need to face it, need to do this. And I think they are. I think it's a movement that is growing in that sense. But I think that the key thing in what you said, Kelly, is that to speak and to amplify the voices that are unheard, that haven't been heard, so to decolonize in that sense. I think that is key. And I do believe that we can do it. I'm on the end of that career as a Waldorf teacher, but certainly there are so many young people coming in now into our schools, and I'm including high school, not just the lower down where the CCE is producing students, but also into our high schools, and to encourage those teachers that are coming into our high schools to carry this impulse and localize the impulse, even in these wealthy areas where the schools are located. Peter Guttenhofer once said that we need to establish schools that are just for class 1 to 4, just all over the country, in rural areas, in wherever there are children. And that would enable so much to be brought into our education system. And I have a little fantasy that maybe that is what needs to happen.
Thank you, Joan. I don't know if anybody would like to add. I think it's important that South African voices were heard this evening from different places and different backgrounds. I think what the South African context shows us all, something that we can all learn from, is that you could say you're kind of almost stacked against impossible odds in this situation. And yet, what you said this evening, all of you actually, but especially Kelly, has kind of focused on an aspect where I think Waldorf education generally can move on. And that is, I'd just like to mention one of the slides you said, my truth is dictated to or subject to context. Now, that's quite a challenging idea from an anthroposophical perspective. And it highlights a kind of gap, in my view, in what the anthroposophical perspective has brought. Because this context is what we today talk about when we say identity and what you've been describing. It's the origins of this diversity. Because in a way, I think traditionally anthroposophy looked beyond that towards unique individuality, which of course is what we are striving to develop. But the journey through that has been kind of short circuited in many ways, that the question of identity has kind of caught up with us because we first have to deal with that question and the question of our multiple identities, the intersectionality of our identities. And that's something that we're all involved in. So, in a way, the situation of the Waldorf and anthroposophical movement in South Africa is a kind of is a place where this issue is so clear. Not that it's easy, but it's so clearly identifiable. In many other places, it's much less clear. And so I think the thoughts that you shared with us have been very important. So I'd like to thank everybody for being here, and especially to Kelly for her fine presentation. I'm sure the PowerPoint will be available as they usually are, so that we can have a look at it again in leisure. And yeah, I just wish you all a very pleasant evening, morning, afternoon, or wherever you are at this time of the day. And I know that Jost will be back in the chair next week. So thank you very much and good night.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Kelly.
Good night, good night, good night.
Thanks.